University College of Washington University and KETC, St. Louis Educational Television Station, present A Course for Television. The Religions of Man, with Dr. Huston Smith, Associate Professor of Philosophy of Washington University.
Buddhism begins with a man. This is the way he is seen in temples and shrines and homes throughout the world. Shells on his head. In the middle of his forehead, the third eye, indicating the capacity for spiritual discernment. The capacity to see beyond things temporal, right through into the heart of reality. His spine is always perfectly straight. His legs are folded in the characteristic lotus position of contemplation. Composed, absolutely serene, is reached out in benediction to a suffering world. This is not an art object to the people who look upon it. This is a symbol of reality and the highest that man has been able to reach to this reality. Arnold Toynbee, our great historian, has said that Gautama Buddha was one of the 6 men who has made more difference in history than any others who have ever lived. Well, the world has known lots of great men. It's had its Napoleons, its Caesars, its Pompey. But somehow these spiritual geniuses work on a different level. They speak to a different kind of audience. They're not backed up by any kind of temporal power. Usually they have no position as far as rank or status is concerned. And yet, in some uncanny way, their words strike home. They speak to the hearts of men and women, where frequently their doctrines seem to go underground, remaining subterranean for sometimes generations, until suddenly the words begin to bear fruit, and we find that the world in strange ways has been transformed. How do you measure the quality, the stature of a life like this? Well, one of the ways, of course, would be to count noses, to number the adherents who profess to follow him and say that there are millions, hundreds of millions in the world today. Another way would be to look at the impact on human history. And yet, somehow these are rather deceptive. Stalin has a lot of millions of followers in a way, following his doctrines, Lenin and Marx, and yet they never were regarded in their lifetime in the way someone like Buddha was regarded. I think one of the most authentic ways, therefore, is to go back to the contemporaries of these men, the men who were actually in their presence, and see how they looked upon them, how they regarded them. And when we come to Buddha, looking at him not through our eyes of 2,500 years later, the eyes of the historians, but the eyes of the contemporaries, we come across a very strange thing indeed. Because we find that the people who associated with this man were genuinely puzzled. They didn't ask the question who he was. They asked a question that sounds very much alike, but really is very different indeed. They asked not who are you, but what are you? Now that takes the whole question into a very different range. Who are you? This would mean questions of your background, of your vocation, where you were born, this kind of thing. But when you ask, what are you? then you're asking into categories of being, really. Animal, vegetable, mineral, human, divine. That was the order on which the question occurred to them. And so the people came to Buddha, and they said, what are you? Are you a god? That was their first impact, their first impulse. And Buddha said, no. Well then, are you an angel? No. Are you a saint? No. Then what are you? And Buddha answered, I am awake. What an odd answer, really. Awake. I think what he meant was that most people live this life in a kind of daze and doze, somnolence. What is the difference between our waking experience and our dream experience? We can dream about almost everything that we experience in our waking life. The difference comes down to a difference in intensity, in concreteness, in clarity, in order. And Buddha felt that he had attained an insight in life which had those qualities of clarity and sureness and firmness which were as far beyond the ordinary wakeful condition as our wakeful condition is beyond our dream condition. And so when he asked for this fundamental characteristic of his being, this is the word he chose. I am awake. And that is what Buddha means, because Buddha isn't a proper name at all. It's a word like Christ or Messiah. It's a title, and the literal meaning is the man who woke up. Now, let's go back to this life and see what it involves. See if we can get into an understanding, really, of what made for the impact which he has had on human history. His birth is encased in loving legend. We're told in the literature that the worlds were flooded with light and glory when Buddha came into the world, that the blind received their sight out of this longing to see the glory of their Lord, that the crimes of the beasts even were hushed, and the fires of hell were quenched. Only one was not happy, and this was Maru, the evil one, who alone did not rejoice. He was born the son of a king of one of the many, many kingdoms. India wasn't divided at this time, and actually he lived his family lived in the northern part, about 100 miles, 200 miles north of Benares. His father being a king, he grew up in a life of luxury, really. Probably not too different from the life in a Scottish castle in the Middle Ages. He tells us in later times that he had garments, that he used ointments only which were made in Benares, the finest of all. He says that he had servants to fan him night and day, who would hold umbrellas over him to shield the sun and the light. And he tells us, I had elephants and I had silver ornaments for my elephants, which in our parlance would be like saying I had Cadillacs and I had lots of chrome on my Cadillac. A life of ease, a life of luxury. He married a lovely wife at the age of 18 or 19. The marriages were young in those days. She is described as really a lovely woman. She was a princess of a neighboring state, majestic as a queen of heaven, constant, ever cheerful night and day, full of dignity and exceeding grace. A son was born to them in their later 20s, a son named Rahula. Here was a person who had everything that the world craved. He had birth, he had a magnificent physique, a wonderful health, intelligence, wealth, and destined for power. And yet, somehow during his life, he became increasingly unhappy with his state. moody, dark, gloomy. Why? Well, the legends account for it through a story of the four passing sights. This is a legend, but like so many legends, it has a kernel of truth. He was told that when he was just born, his father went, as was the custom, to consult a fortune teller. And the fortune teller said to the father, "If your son stays in your home and follows in your steps, you will become the greatest king that India has ever known, the first to unify the country. But if he becomes dissatisfied and leaves that status, then he will not become a king at all. He will become a savior of mankind." Confronted with this option, the father had no question. He wanted his son to become a king. So he did everything to keep him satisfied. According to the legend, all unpleasantness was removed. All sickness, poverty, disease, death, all signs of it were cleared. And even when young Buddha went out riding in the chariot, the highways, byways, were cleared of these unpleasant objects. But one day, the clearers of the way missed their job, and a man who was diseased was lying by the side of the road. Buddha wanted to know what was the matter, and that day he learned the secret of sickness. On another day, the same thing happened. This time he learned the secret of the woe of old age. And a third time it happened, and this time there was a corpse that he saw. That day he learned the secret of death. And on a final time he learned, because he saw a monk in his yellow robe and shaven hair, he learned of the life of renunciation. This is a tale, but it's not merely a fable. It's a story with a point, because these point up what must have been true in Buddha's life, an awareness of suffering as it comes through sickness, old age, and death, and a determination to do everything in his power to help his fellow men who were caught in these mortal coils. Well, he grew increasingly restless in his condition of luxury, and when he reached the age of 29, he finally made the break from his family ties. The story of his departure is told. It's a dramatic scene centering in a banquet feast where the father is trying to cheer him up. Buddha sits throughout the evening immobile, refusing to utter a word. And finally, the father, the rest of the guests depart, leaving only Buddha at the head of the table and the dancing girls that have been brought in to entertain him. When at 2 o'clock in the morning the dancing girls, through exhaustion, collapse, Buddha picks his way over their prostrate bodies, goes to bid a silent farewell to his wife and sleeping child, jumps on his favorite white horse, rides out to the forest, and with his attendant with him, he then exchanges clothes with his attendant, plunges into the forest, tells the attendant to go back to the castle with news of what he has done, and plunges into the forest in search of enlightenment. There follow 6 years. 6 years in which he gives his full attention to trying to obtain this enlightenment. First, he consults teachers of Hinduism, learning everything he can from them, only to find that it is inadequate. Then he tries asceticism, all kinds of restraints, self-denial, a mortification, holding his breath until his ears would roar, fasting so intense that they're unbelievable, only to come to the conclusion that this was not the way, but rather that the way in this regard lay in the middle path, halfway between indulgence on the one hand and mortification on the other. The concept of the rationed life, giving the body everything it needs for optimum functioning, just enough food, just enough sleep, but no more. Then, having come to that conclusion and putting aside his asceticism, he comes finally to a long period where, through intense thought, philosophizing, and a combination of mystical exercises, he finally attains to the enlightenment under the famous bo tree in the deer park surrounding Benares. He was then 35. 45 years lie ahead of him. After he attained this enlightenment, he rose, and already there were some who were surrounding him for his teachings. He arose and he gave his first sermon in this deer park of Benares, which contains the essence, really, of his doctrine. And to this we should be turning in just a moment. But before we come to his teachings, actually, it's important to see the relation of Buddhism to Hinduism. Where did Buddha stand in relation to Hinduism? Buddhism, when we come to it, is a very strange kind of religion. Buddha teaches nothing about God, nothing about theology. There are no prayers, no rituals, no authority. He was opposed to the priests. He was opposed to tradition. Now, this is a strange and curious kind of religion, indeed. And the only way we can understand his stand on these points is to see where religion had come to in Hinduism. Hinduism had come to the point where many of these things, which are usually associated with religion, had become fetters, had become a burden. Take theology, for example. Well, let me put them all on the board. Theology, ritual, authority, grace, and mystery, and tradition. All these things have a place in religion, an important place. In fact, I would say it's impossible ultimately to have a religion without these things. And yet, they can all become overbalanced, an encumbrance, where the form can replace the meaning. And that's what had happened in the Hinduism of Buddha's day, which is why Vivekananda called Buddha a rebel child of Hinduism. He was a reformer of Hinduism, and because these had become imbalanced, overbalanced, he spoke out critically, sharply against each one. Theology, he said, don't waste your time in speculation. He was an empiricist. He said, use the example of the arrow thickly smeared with poison. Suppose you have a man who is wounded by such an arrow. What does he do? Does he ask, who shot this arrow? Was he fair or ugly? From what direction was he standing? No, you remove the arrow first, and then you turn to these questions. Similarly with Buddha. He asked his followers, did I ever teach you that God exists? And the answer is no. Did I teach you he didn't exist? No. Did I teach you the world was eternal? No. Did I teach you it is not eternal? No. And he goes through all these speculative questions, and finally he comes out, what have I taught you? And the answer is, you have taught us suffering and the end of suffering. Infinitely practical, empirical in his concern. Similarly with ritual. He was a rationalist, he was a moralist, rather than a ritualist. Had no patience with this at all. Similarly with regarding authority. Work out your own salvation, he insisted. Don't expect the priests to do it for you. And also on this point, he broke caste, refusing to abide by these social distinctions, allowing into his order the outcast and the untouchable. In grace, he said, don't look for help outside yourself, because ultimately it's a matter of self-effort. Work out your own salvation with diligence. When I'm gone, don't pray to me, because when I'm gone, I'll really be gone, beyond all hope of help. mystery? No. He said, "By this ye shall know that a man is not my disciple if he tries to work a miracle." Absolutely scientific in his sense. And in tradition, no. He cast aside the Sanskrit and taught in college. Now, with this background, I think we can see the place of Buddhism and understand the way in which he approached the religious problem. Ultimately, it is now being thought by the scholars, he accepted the basic principles of Hinduism. He was not against Hinduism as such. He was against the condition, the corruption which had entered into Hinduism and the misinterpretation. And he wanted to get back to what was urgent, what was important. And that, rather than a real rejection of all these things, was his animus and his approach. Now, to his philosophy, to his ideas themselves. They're contained in the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. This is, if we must select, this is the heart of the doctrine. And to these now, I want to come briefly in our closing. What would you say if you had to pick out the four most important things, the four truest things you could say about life? Well, I don't know if you'll agree with these, but it's always interesting to see what a man of this stature says are the four truest things we can get straight about this life that we live. First of all, life is, I'm going to have to use the Pali word here, dukkha. This is often translated suffering, but that's really not quite right. Life is dislocated. Dukkha is the word which is used for an axle which is out of its socket. It's the word which is used when a bone, too, has been slipped out of its joint. We all know the pain. We know how movement is impeded in that situation and how pain accompanies it. Life is out of joint, which impedes its functioning and brings in pain. He didn't stop there. He went to pinpoint the 6 points in life where this dislocation becomes extreme. First of all is the fact of birth. Birth brings a dislocation, and we know today how our psychologists, how our psychoanalysts are emphasizing the shock which comes from the ejection from the womb when we are thrown into a cold world. Birth brings a certain dislocation, and after that, if the birth is difficult, an individual can list throughout his life like a ship with a hole in the side. A second danger spot is disease. Well, we know that very well. A third danger point is decrepitude. Now, not old age, Buddha says, but decrepitude. It's the approach to old age. In the early days of the airplane, it was very easy to get the plane up off the ground, relatively easy. Coming in was the difficulty. Youth, with its vigorous vitality, can take off well, but what about the coming in life? Decrepitude, the third danger spot, and finally death, with the phobia, which the fear of death, which can characterize so much life. Wasn't it Jung who said he never had a patient over 40 whose basic problem didn't center in the fear of approaching death? Here then are some of the points where life gets out of joint. Now, having noted the symptoms, the second noble truth goes on to the cause. The cause of suffering is tanha. I'm sorry, but we have to get these basic terms straight, and they've been mistranslated in the past. This is usually translated desire, but that won't really do. A life completely apart from desire would be death, and to die isn't to solve the problem of living at all. This is not desire. This is wrong desire. Or, to put it more sharply, it's the desire for private fulfillment. The trouble is that we want satisfaction for ourselves. We want to increase the distance between ourselves and our fellow beings. And it's this distance. We want to have a higher salary or be more famous. And this pull towards separation from life, that, Buddha says, is what brings all the trouble. Well, it's worth thinking that the highest state of joy that we have a word for, what do we call it? Ecstasy, isn't it? And that term, what does the term mean? The capacity to stand outside ourselves. Ex out of, stacy, stand. It really comes in pretty close to what Buddha is saying here. But now that we've seen the symptoms, now that we've made the diagnosis, what's the prognosis? Is it hopeless? Buddha says no. A cure is possible. And the cure lies in the overcoming of tanha. It is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible to make this basic fundamental reversal in life from pulling apart to letting the circulation flow and joining again into life as a whole. Well, maybe it's possible, but how's it to be done? Is it going to be left? Is Buddha going to leave it up in the air this way with simply an abstract formula? And the answer is no. Buddha was a psychologist, infinitely practical. And so he goes on to point the way to the cure, and then what about the treatment? The way to the cure. And here he presents an eightfold path, a course of graded instruction, so to speak, which, if followed, will lead to the overcoming of tanha, which will bring life back into joint and keep it from the deadly dislocation which brings in the source of all the trouble. Well, next week we're going to be turning to the eightfold path, the way in which this basic reversal in life is to be accomplished. We'll be turning from Buddha as theorist, as we've seen him this evening, to Buddha as practitioner. But as we think ahead towards the eightfold path, it's well to remember that behind the path itself lies the man who first trod that path. The man who could have been a king but chose instead to be a savior of mankind. Buddha, the man who woke up.
The Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, the St. Louis Educational Television Station and Production Center.
This is National Educational Television.